Hello, this is Jay, and you may have already heard, but I want to make sure that everyone knows applications are now being accepted for my online yoga teacher training starting in January. Space is limited, and registration will be closing at the end of December. If listening to this show has become a vehicle for furthering your learning in yoga, and you have interest in making a commitment to pursuing that in a more focused way, the training is a year-long program, and it's co-creative, meaning that it's designed to fit to you rather than you having to fit to it. And as a way of sharing with you more what that means, I've thoroughly enjoyed recording this series of mini talks with people who are currently participating. Today, I talk with Katie. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Jay.
How's it going?
It's going pretty well today.
I'm glad to hear that. I was glad to see your name pop up. I appreciate you signing up to do this.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it. Was happy to hear that you were doing this.
Well, it's been really wonderful for me to have these moments with people in the training as we're kind of winding down this year. And I was reflecting on you, and I was trying to remember, I don't think that you and I had any practice together before the training, had we?
We had not. I'd been listening to your podcast for a couple years, maybe. I found you during the pandemic, so I'd just been listening for a while, but I hadn't actually done any practice.
See, and that for me has always been a bit of a test case of sorts, you among several others, because a lot of other folks in the training are people who had practiced with me before, even just with like a video or something. And I've always intended that the training could be like different things. It could play different roles to different kinds of people, depending on who they were, what they might need. And with you, when you first came into the training with your engineering background and you're already doing a yoga therapy training, I don't know how far along you are. I think you might be a large way through it, if not done. And I think you said you might have had other teacher training too. Like, had you done other like yoga teacher training as well?
Yeah, I had, during the pandemic, I entered into the pandemic with, being fully in the engineering role, and made my way, got into the pandemic and found a, online 200-hour yoga teacher training, and just thought like everything had moved online. It was very affordable. So I thought, just for fun, like I'll do this. And, there was definitely some value to it, but I got out of it and was kind of thinking, I don't even want to do this yoga, let alone teach it. So I had the 200-hour, but I didn't at all feel prepared to actually teach a yoga class. And I had started the yoga therapy training as well. And that one was great, helping me, more deeply understand different practices I could work with and really help me understand working with people in a one-on-one therapeutic context. But I was definitely still just missing this deeper understanding of yoga, like from a traditional perspective. And yeah, just thinking about like, what is yoga in my own life? And thinking about teaching a class, I really didn't have much of an idea what to do with there yet. But I had been listening to your show, and so when you said you were going to offer teacher training, it was a pretty quick no-brainer. Like, I think Jay's the person that could help me sort through this.
Well, that's so beautiful. I mean, that was kind of where I was going to go. That was going to be my next question. My curiosity is, with all these other things that you've done, and maybe you were kind of just going there, like what role has the training played for you in the kind of bigger picture of your yoga, I guess?
So I guess taking a step back a year, thinking about yoga, I'd seen different yoga studios. I had read different yoga texts, and I just had no real understanding of any sort of coherent something that meant something to me in terms of yoga. So I think a good word is like connection. Like, what is my connection to yoga and what is its role in my own life? And if I'm going to be a teacher, like, what am I going to bring to the class that's beyond do this pose and that pose? So I think that's really what I was looking for with this class. And I think it's something that just it being a year long and you just creating so much space to explore it from our own perspectives, I think just really worked out.
I'm so glad to hear that, Katie. Because honestly, I also remember like some people really take to like the actual asana pranayama practice that I do. And you did it some, but there was points where you're like, I don't know if it's exactly right for me right now. And I was glad that we were able to have it make sense for you, because that's the whole point of the training. So it seems like that was the case. Would you say so?
Yeah. And I mean, I think that the way that you've brought it all to us, it's not like you have to do things my way. It's this is what I bring, and let's work to, take what works for me. And for the most part, I love your class and just like your teaching style. And I see how just a great practice for many, many people. And I feel like 95% of it's so great for me. And like the way it unfolded was just having complete freedom to be like, okay, I can let go of that 5 to 10% and, bring in other things that better serve me.
Well, I guess the other thing that I'm curious about now as we're sort of wrapping up, and you did sort of mention this, that you did just start to teach some classes or two. And I guess I'm feeling like you said earlier that before you started, you didn't feel like you were necessarily so ready to teach classes outside of maybe one-to-one, more like yoga therapy work. But are you feeling more confident about it now?
Yeah, it's actually been pretty amazing. think I'm about 3 weeks into teaching, so I've taught about 6 or 7 classes. And yeah, it's been wonderful. Of course, there's the learning curve that comes from, talking about being able to teach and thinking about it being able to teach and actually being in the room. But yeah, it's been amazing just being able to show up and teach in a way that just feels true to me and have people respond to that. Which, yeah, as I said, I don't think I could have done that after the 200-hour training I had. I think I came out of that one with more like, how do I fit to this script that doesn't really resonate with me? Whereas now I feel like I can more teach from a space that is coming through me and bringing in the different threads that we've talked about and just continuing to build upon that foundation.
Well, I really appreciate what you said earlier as well, when you talked about asking yourself those questions about, well, what does it mean to me? Because I feel like those questions are what lay that groundwork for you to teach from that space that you just said you're starting to teach from. And, I look forward to seeing where you take what you're going to do. Do you have any ideas about what you're going to do next? I know you're a writer and you've got a lot of things in mind, but have you thought about where you're going to take it outside of just continuing on with this new yoga class you got?
I do. And my problem is always that I have way too many ideas and that I need to get focused and simplify things more. But yeah, I mean, my writing, I've been, loving integrating what we've been talking about in the yoga class, like bringing that into my writing. Yeah, I'm just very excited to keep up with these yoga classes and start actually working one-on-one with people as well.
I love it. I really appreciated your writing and the emails that you sent me and our exchanges. It's been very affirming for me and rewarding to have you around. So thanks so much for all that you've brought to this year and for taking this moment with me again. I really appreciate it, Katie.
Great. Well, thank you, Jay. I appreciate it all as well. It's really been a wonderful experience.
Cool. Well, we still got a little time. I'll see you soon, okay?
We do still have time.
Yeah, we got a little time. So I'll be seeing you in class, all right?
Yes.
All right. Take care.
All right. You as well.
All right. Here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new. All the rest of y'all, what's up? How's everyone doing? Did you have a good holiday? Did you even celebrate the holiday? Did you get to have some pumpkin pie? I don't know if you like pumpkin pie, but it is by far my most favorite dessert. Yes, I said it. Not chocolate, not ice cream, none of that. I'm a pumpkin pie man through and through. Yup. Anyways, I got to have some pumpkin pie, and I do really enjoy that delicacy. And I just hope that you're doing okay, whether you celebrate the holidays or had some pumpkin pie or not. And I appreciate you listening. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who sent me emails with thoughtful suggestions about how I might help my hip pain. I really appreciate that. It's so sweet that people out there actually care and would send me notes. And even if you didn't send me a note, even if you just thought it for a moment, oh God, I hope your hip's better, Jay. Thanks. It counts. And I really appreciate it, y'all. I did go see the ortho doctor this week, and I have a little bit of an update, but I'm going to save it for the other side once again, because today's talk with Bernie Clark certainly played into my calculus of choice making regarding my hip. And it was so great to reconnect with Bernie again after these years that have gone by. It's been like 3 or 4 years or something since Bernie was last on the show. He's been on, I think this is his third solo appearance and 4 appearances total, third solo appearance. And he's been on since the very beginning of this show. And he recently published the third in his Your Body, Your Yoga trilogy entitled Your Upper Body, Your Yoga. And I have to say, I have the other two. I got all 3. I have the trilogy myself. But for some reason, reading this third edition at this moment in my life when I've been dealing with my hip and looking at my body through different lenses, I really experienced Bernie's work in a different way, in a way I hadn't before. And I have found a new appreciation. Not that I didn't always appreciate Bernie, but maybe you'll hear. It was really wonderful to just have the synchronicity of reading the book at this moment and then having this opportunity to talk to Bernie about it. It was really great. So I so appreciated this moment to have with him again, and it's my pleasure to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to that, I do want to mention that I'm going to be doing some live free info sessions for the teacher training. If you've been listening to the top of the show for the last few weeks, I've been doing these mini talks and mentioning that I have an online yoga teacher training starting in January. Well, if you want to have a chance to talk to me live and ask questions, or maybe you just want to hang out, even if you don't want to do the training, if you just want to come and hang out and talk about stuff, I'm doing some live video sessions that you are very welcome to attend. I'm doing the first set on December 7th. We've got 2 different times to accommodate different time zones. If you want to find out information about coming to one of those sessions, you can go to jbrownyoga.com/training. It'll be fun if you want to just hang out, have a chance to shoot the shit, as they say. Is that an okay saying? Am I allowed to say that? Yeah, I could say shoot the shit, can I? It'll probably be deeper than shooting shit, though. We'll probably have some conversations around yoga that are meaningful to us. That would be my intent. So I don't know if that's the best expression. In any case, I'm doing some of those free info sessions on December 7th, and you can find out the information if you go to jbrownyoga.com/training. Also, I want to say thanks to our podcast premium subscribers. Specifically today, I want to shout out Lucy Lomax and Beata Kiesling. Cheers to you, Lucy and Beata. Thanks so much for supporting the show. And if you're newer around here and you were not aware, the most recent 52 episodes of the show are always part of the public feed. We also have a podcast premium subscription that gives you access to the full archives, which is quite extensive at this point. Also, it's just a way to be supportive of the show and help us keep it going. It's choose your rate. You cancel at any time. If you are hard up for any money right now and you happen to find an old episode that you want to listen to, just email us. We'll definitely hook you up. But if you can give a little something, it makes a difference. We're very grateful to people who are doing that. To learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber, go to jbrownyoga.com. All right, that's that, y'all. Like I said, I've got some stuff to share on the other side, but I think we should just get to the business at hand. Let's do it. Let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Bernie Clark. Hello?
Hello, Jay.
Hi, Bernie.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. All things considered. How about yourself?
Yeah, I can't complain. The weather's nice. The sun is shining. Life is good.
I'm glad to hear that. And I'm already recording, and I'd like to consider us having just begun. I know you listen, so I'm just making sure.
Sure, no problem.
And I have to say, it really is great to speak to you again. You're really a bit of a signpost for me with this show, because the first time you came on the show was in June 2016. I believe that was within the first 6-7 months of I started it. And it was the 24th episode I ever did. I believe this is episode number 355.
Wow.
And, it's kind of hard for me to go back and listen to that one because I was so green and... and so it's kind of hard to go back and listen to that one. But then you were on again in 2019 when the second book in the trilogy came out, if I'm not mistaken. Your Spine, Your Yoga was in 2019.
Right, yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
And in that one, it was better. But having you come again now, all these years later, with the third and final one in the trilogy, I'm in such a different place. And touching base with you again is really having me reflect back and see growth. And I really appreciate people in my life who mirror back to me in that way. And you're someone who does that. You may not know that, but you're someone who has done that for me. So thanks for being here. Thanks for giving me your time again.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, 6 years ago that we first started. Well, of course, these books took about 8 years in total to design and develop and complete. So it's a bit of a passing of an era for me.
Well, that's kind of what I was curious about. It seems like they were kind of mapped out for you from the beginning. Is that right? Because I noticed you had written what the next volume were going to be in the last one. I don't know if that was in the preface of the first one as well. Had you always envisioned all three before you started them?
Yeah, I had. I mean, I started this idea back in 2010, 2011. Of course, this is all inspired by Paul Grilly, who was the one that really brought the reality of human variation and skeletal differences to yoga teachers. And I kept asking him for a book on it because I wanted to sit down and really study the book. But Paul's way of teaching is more demonstrative. He wants to be in front of students and show different people. And so he did a video on this, which really got me into it in the first place in the early 2000s. But, when it came to writing a book, he just said, "Nah, you do that. So eventually I took up the challenge. And in 2013, I decided, okay, I will try it. And I did come up with this idea that there's going to be too much for one book. So let's break it into parts. Let's do the lower body first, and then the core body second, and we'll finish with the upper body. And 8 years later, we finally got through all that.
And did you always have, like I noticed in the last two, they really do have the same kind of structure to them with the sidebars and kind of the way you look at both like form and then function, and you kind of lay things out. Had you always envisioned it that way from the beginning, or was there some kind of creative process in terms of how it actually came about when you started doing it?
That idea was there from the very first book. I was going to look at the form and describe the bits, and people who weren't interested in anatomy too much, they'd skip over that part and then just go to the function. What does this form mean? Like, what does it mean if I've got too much tibial rotation or too little? How does that affect where my feet will go? As opposed to what is the tibia? So I always had that idea that to be form and then function. But as I got more into the writing, I don't know if you noticed that the books got a little bit thicker and thicker because there was just more I wanted to share. So it did grow and change in that way.
Well, I feel like I have to cop to something because an interesting thing happened getting ready to talk to you today, where I was reading through just like the introduction and preface of the latest volume, Your Lower Body, Your Yoga, or your upper body. Your upper body, Your Yoga is the most recent one. And I was reading through the intro and preface of it, and I was feeling like, wow, like this really addresses many of like the questions that I was asking of you in previous visits to the show. Like I very much, especially that first one, was in kind of this defensive crouch around looking at yoga through like an anatomical or biomechanical lens. And I think the reason I was in that crouch is I felt like people were trying to use those lenses to legitimize yoga. And I wanted yoga to be legitimate on its own, not have to be legitimized through those lenses. But getting ready to talk to you today, I realized something that I don't think that you were ever the person that I needed to be pushing back on. And you know how I know it is I read the introduction and preface of the most recent book, and I was like, wow, this really addressed all the questions I used to have in the past. It really established this as like a yogic lens in certain ways. So I thought, wow, is this new? Did he like write a new preface and introduction? And then when I went back and looked at the last volume, it was almost exactly the same.
Yeah.
There was a little bit that you added, which we can talk about when it comes to like stability and mobility, it seems, in those like concepts, the summary of concepts. But what I realized is that I just either didn't read the introduction and preface last time or didn't read it in the same way that I did now. And as I mentioned to you in my email, I have been recently wanting to look at my body through these kinds of lenses. And in a way, your book is the yogic lens compared to other ones that I've been looking through. So I just wanted to acknowledge that to you, that I really do feel like there's a way to look at anatomy that feels like an inquiry and feels like it isn't a reductionist thing. And there's ways to look at yoga that are more reductionist, that feel like less about a yoga of lens. And if people criticize me in the past for like throwing you in that other camp, and I think they were right. So I owe that acknowledgement to you, because I really did feel like with this book, it really had a yogic lens. And I'm curious, do you think of yourself as like a yoga teacher first and then like an anatomist, or is it all mixed in as one thing?
Well, no, I guess that's an interesting question, Jay. The old Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, you can never step in the same river twice. So even though I'm telling you that I had the same vision 8 years ago when I started as I did today, I honestly don't really know what I was thinking 8 years ago, because that river is long gone. I think I was staying to that, but I started this after 15 years of doing yoga and in other realms, if you will. I never considered myself an anatomy guy. It was just something I was fascinated by Paul Grilly's exposition about human differences, and that just triggered me to go into this more deeply. And even after 8 years of doing this, I still don't consider myself a real anatomy guy, because I know the holes in my knowledge. You see what I've written, but you don't see all the stuff I don't know. So my first love was always mythology, religions, history. And yes, I've got a degree in science, but that was up in the astronomy area, astrophysics and rocket science stuff, not inside the bones of the body. So it was fascinating to me, and I had to kind of self-educate. But yeah, I don't consider myself a yoga anatomy guy.
Which one's harder to grasp? Rocket science or the bones in the body?
Oh, I think astrophysics is a little bit more challenging in terms of the math and so forth. This one, it was a lot of research. And that's why Paul Grilly said he didn't want to do it. Like, if you'd see my library, the tons of books I got, from Gray's Anatomy to ancient anatomy books to modern books, and just the amount of research was kind of daunting. And if I had realized what I was getting myself into, I may not have done it. But you look at my books and the amount of footnotes, each book is like 1,000 footnotes. So that was the daunting part, not the difficulty of the subject matter. It was just the breadth of it.
Well, it does seem to me that you've come to a number of key principles, even in those summary of concepts at the beginning of the books, where you, after looking at all of this stuff, you have come to certain things that you feel important to say. You are unique and no one is average is one of your titles. And I really liked the bit about the airline pilot cockpits. Maybe you'll explain that to listeners. Maybe people have already read the book, but just in case they haven't, I felt like it's one of the best ways. And my father-in-law is a Navy pilot. And when I told it to him, I mentioned to him, he loved it. Right. So maybe for people listening who, if they have maybe not read the book, you could tell people how we know something about human bodies from airline pilot cockpits.
Well, this goes back to the days when Orville invented his brother Wilbur, and they both went on their little converting bicycles into aircraft in Kitty Hawk. Ever since the Wright brothers invented the first functional airplane, armies have been trying to get a hold of this technology. And so the armed forces were paying money to aircraft manufacturers to build newer and better aircraft. And of course, the Air Force was training the pilots to fly these aircraft. And the first iteration of any aircraft always crashed. And the developers kept blaming the pilots, saying, these pilots don't know how to fly this stuff. And the pilots were blaming the developers. And so for decades, there was this finger pointing going on. Was it a design error or was it pilot error? In the 1950s, the US Air Force decided to study this once and for all. So they hired a researcher named Gilbert Daniels, and he measured pilots in 100 different ways. I think it was 140 different ways, like how long are their arms, how tall are they, what's the length of their from the sit bone to the crown of their head. This was a study in morphology, just the shape of the human body. And Daniels kind of knew where his study was going to lead him, but he did the research, and he investigated over 4,000 pilots. And normally the Air Force hires pilots because they know cockpits are not that big, so you don't want somebody that's really tall. So anyone who was over 5'10", 5'11", they were disqualified. But you also don't want somebody really short, because you got to be able to reach the pedals and so forth. So anyone under 5'6" was disqualified. So they thought they hired a fairly homogeneous group of people. But Daniels discovered, when he measured all these different criteria, that there was no average airplane pilot. They were all unique. You might find one who's average height, but that's only one characteristic. When you start averaging average height and average weight and an average arm length and average sitting height, you find out nobody's actually unique. So there's no way to build one cockpit that will fit every pilot. And so the Air Force took that to heart and said, okay, aircraft developers, Hughes, McDonnell Douglas, you guys have to build a cockpit that will fit every pilot. And the aircraft developers said, that's crazy. We're going to have 4,000 different cockpits. You know how expensive that's going to be? We want to mass produce these planes. And the Air Force just shrugged and said, you figure it out. So their engineers went away, and like clever engineers, they came up with a very elegant solution. They didn't build 4,000 different cockpits. They built customizable cockpits. When the pilot gets into the plane, he raises the seat up or lowers it down or moves it forward. And we inherited all this in our cars today. When you get into a car you've never driven before, first thing you do will adjust the seat, adjust the steering wheel, make it come closer or tilt it up and down. So they acknowledged these variations firstly, which is most important. And then they said, now how do we accommodate these variations? They did it by customizing the cockpit. So what's that got to do with yoga? The same thing happens with our yoga students. Nobody is average. Everyone has different leg lengths and arm lengths and anteversion of the femur and the acetabulum. So you need, if you have 30 students, you need 30 different yoga classes. Or you can customize it so the students can figure out how to customize the class to fit themselves, just like the driver does for the car seat and the pilot does for the cockpit.
Yeah, the poses and the lines got to be adjustable, huh?
Right. What works for this pilot? What works for this student? Given the fact she has huge tibial torsion and her toes are going to point outward. And if you try to say everyone's feet must be parallel in mountain pose, you've just put her into huge internal rotation at the hips, which is going to cause FAI, femoral acetabular impingement syndrome, as she folds forward every time. But if you allow her to go where it's comfortable for her feet to be, which is pointing outward, her hips are neutral. So you have to let her customize the yoga to fit her body.
Right. And I think the tendency to want to have there be like one optimal thing that would be right for everyone is something that you mentioned. First of all, to what you're just saying, you talk about like the flaw of averages so that, and guess maybe you could talk about that. Like, what's the difference? You talk about ranges, not averages. What's the difference what do you mean by that?
Well, throughout my books, I cite these statistics, like some people's upper bodies are longer than other people's upper bodies relative to their legs. And there's certain ethnic backgrounds where you might have more of this or less of this, depending on whether your ancestors came from Europe, Siberia, the jungles. And you can cite these averages and the difference between people in Europe, people in Asia, people in Africa. But then other people get very upset and say you might be racist or something. You're looking at these differences between people. And I say, well, forget all the averages because it's irrelevant. Who cares what an average is? What's important is what you are. And you might find, let's suppose on average, women are 2 inches shorter than men. Well, okay, that's a well-known average, but no woman is exactly average. And you'll have women who are much taller than the average man, and you have men who are much shorter than the average woman. So what's important more is what the range of human variation is. That 95% of the people are between 5'2" and 6'1". So that's the range. And that's only the normal range. That's 95% of the people. Anyone who's outside that, the other 5%, they're called abnormal. Well, that's 1 in 20. So if you have a class of, say, 40 students, 2 of them are going to be abnormal in some way, maybe shorter than normal or taller than normal. So the average itself to me is kind of meaningless. What's interesting is the range of human variation. And even that is just covering 95% of the population. Then you have those people who are out of the range, so-called abnormal. But that's not a mark against how nice of a person they are. That just means mathematically they're outside this 95% range.
I remember thinking about this quite a bit when I had my children and taking them to the pediatrician, and they have those like charts, like growth and weight charts. And there's like averages. And if your daughter's like just under or just over, like it seemed like those are kind of arbitrary things. And sometimes people want to know what's normal or what's healthy. And and it can't be an average, right? Like you said, it has to be individual.
Some people get very upset with these word averages. I remember there was a headline, must be about 20 years ago now, that people were complaining because there was a study of math scores in the American school system. And the headline said something like, half of the children in North America are below average in math. Well, that's what average means. Half are above average, half are below average. So people got worried that half of the school kids in the US are below average in math. Well, that's just the definition of average. It doesn't mean that they're better than, say, Asian students or European students. That's just the way this thing works. So let's not overprize average.
Yeah, I've been coming up against it a little bit with one of my daughters too, who's like, for some reason, decides she needs to count calories. I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like, the way calories affect different people is going to be different. There can't be like one right amount of calories that everybody is supposed to eat. There's maybe a range that might be considered on average healthy, but it's to reduce it down to like one number based on an average cannot be helpful, it seems like.
No, it's a shortcut that doesn't really work. Better is to figure out, how do the amount of calories your daughter consume affect her?
Right.
Like, if she eats this amount of calories, does she feel good, bad, sluggish, active, alert? So what's really important is how something affects you. And who cares about the average? The average is just an indicator, something to focus your attention on. But you should never be comparing yourself to the average, because that's always just one point of reference. And we're not one-dimensional beings. We have tons of dimensions to it.
Right. And that's why you are also, it seems to me like the premise of your books often is a bit of kind of addressing certain things that were also in the yoga world. I think we talked about that in our previous conversations too. One being like, there's no one right alignment, no universal alignment, which goes to everything that we've just been saying about averages and normal and variation, that the idea that there's going to be one right alignment is going to be fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, and I'm not saying alignment's not important. I think alignment has a lot of benefits, but what's important is your alignment. So the challenge is, how do you have the student find their alignment, the alignment that works for them, instead of imposing some theoretical construct on top of them, saying, well, this is the average alignment, so you should do this. Well, sorry, no, that doesn't help at all. What is the alignment that works for you? Now, that's harder. As a teacher, that's a lot more difficult to teach, because you don't have just one map that you can overlay on top of every student.
Right. And I guess, another thing that we talked about in relationship to asana practice was the Goldilocks principle, which I've often referenced, and also this idea of stressing tissues. This was like an area you and I kind of got into a little, like I got all up in the bunch about the idea of stressing tissues. I guess I was thinking about it because it's mentioned in the most recent book too. Specifically, I wrote this quote, "Comfortable is the opposite of stress." And I guess what I was kind of interested in, because I know now, having just gone through this physical therapy and specifically tried like stressing areas that I haven't been stressing because they were injured, and seeing what that does. So I think I understand more what you're saying when you talk about stressing tissues. I guess my question about it today is that when we talk about it, how much challenge does have to be to stress tissues? Like, if I'm just moving my body and engaging my body, that doesn't count as a stressing of tissues. Does it have to be like a challenging where you've hit some kind of edge?
That's a big topic, Jay. And the Goldilocks model is a good one, but there's another one that I've come up with called the anti-fragility curve. I didn't coin this term, but I'm applying it to the yoga world. And imagine like a mountain where on one side, say the south side, there's a very gentle slope up to the top of the mountain. But on the north side, there's a steep cliff, and you're in danger of falling off and tumbling 1,000 feet down to the prairie below. That is a curve that reflects the value of stress in our tissues. So if you imagine a graph that has that shape to it, and the height, the vertical axis represents the amount of health we have, and the horizontal axis represents the amount of stress we have. So as you start to increase the stress, you're increasing health to a point. If you go over the edge of the cliff, now you've damaged yourself. You've gone into a region of stress called distress. But before you go over the edge of the cliff, you're in a region called eustress. So stress itself isn't good or bad. If you have too much, you're in distress. If you have less than that, you're in a healthy region called eustress. But if you look at right at the beginning of the curve where there's no stress, there's also no health. So to not stress the body at all is not good. So as soon as you start to stress the body a bit, you're gaining some health. And you can continue that up until you get to the top of the mountain where it kind of levels off a bit. And then if you continue to overstress it, now you've damaged yourself. So that's kind of the Goldilocks extreme. You can do too little, you can do too much. But how much is right is really a question for you to decide. You don't have to be right at the top of the mountain and risking falling over the edge. You can back off quite a ways and still get 90% of the benefits of the stress, but you're not in danger. Or if you're injured, now you can't go that high anymore. Maybe you can only do 50% of the stress. So you always need some stress, and you're always getting some benefit from some stress. The question is, where's the optimal amount? And I would suggest it's probably in the 80 to 90% range, where you're not risking going over the edge, but you're still getting 80 to 90% of the benefit of the stress. Now, how do you know that? Well, that's going to come from your own life experience. Nobody can tell you that a priori. I can't look at you and say, this is what you have to do, or this is what you should never do. I don't know. All I can do is suggest some things for you to try. And I can be like ground control and you're flying your own plane. I can give you some advice, but you're flying the plane. You have to decide what you're going to do up there.
Certainly true. And I think I like this. I have a very new feeling about the word stressing the tissues and stress in general. I think, again, in the past, it was sort of triggering for me because there was so much people like overexerting their bodies in yoga classes in the name of strength and flexibility. And in my experience, a lot of that pushing on the body wasn't actually making them stronger. Sometimes maybe there was more ranges of motion because we were pushing on our bodies to do it, but there was a lot of repercussions from pushing on our bodies so hard. So the idea of stressing the tissues kind of was triggering, but I like that we're making stress like not a bad word, like sometimes stress is like we should stay away from it, but actually thinking of like, oh, just a healthy amount of stress is right for your body and your mind, I think that's a healthy way to think of stress rather than trying to like be stress free or de-stress all the time, that it's about finding like a healthy Goldilocks to your stress levels or something.
Yeah, exactly. And you're not the only one. A lot of people say I should stop using the term stress. I should use load or exercise or other things.
Yeah.
But the word is stress, and it's Walter Cannon back in the 1930s who came up with this, whole idea of we're overstressed and we're activating the sympathetic nervous system and all this stress response. But again, that's when we go into distress. Stress itself is neutral. It's like rain. You can have a little bit of rain, it's good. You can have a lot of rain, it's flooding, but rain itself's not good or bad. We need some rain, but you can have too much of it. We need stress in life. Now, if you have no stress in life, you will atrophy. You'll quickly die. People, at the end of their lives, they're in wheelchairs all the time. You can see them atrophying right before your eyes. And I'm saying this because my mother-in-law is in this state right now. And I can just see her. She's down to a wheelchair now. She's got advanced dementia, Alzheimer's, and she can't stand up. She can't do anything. And you see that with no stress in the body, it's just decaying. It's atrophying. So we need stress. But yes, you can do too much. I'm not saying do too much. When I say stress your tissues, I'm not saying do too much. If the doctor says,
I know you said that
aspirin,
years ago, and I didn't hear you, Bernie. I know. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's a triggering word
in the past, but like I said, the word, like we have associations with certain words, I think.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me because also this is there's some stuff that you added to the concepts. And specifically, the word stability was there, which I thought was interesting. And not necessarily strength, because a lot of people seem to have moved away from strength and using the word stability. And I guess you offer a very clear definition for what stability is. I get that from Professor Stuart McGill, who is a spine biomechanic. He's recently retired. He worked for decades at the University of Waterloo. And my work in studying with him, he wrote the introduction to the second book, Your Spine, Your Yoga. Stable is the place where it takes the least amount of effort to remain
in that position where you're strong, you're stable, and if you get a slight knock, you can reestablish your equilibrium. That's stable.
Yes,
there's lots of different ways you can define it.
I actually
that's
wrote
one that I resonate with.
Yeah. I wrote a quote from the book that said, "Steady, firm, enduring, resistant to sudden change, but functionally able to adjust to movement."
Yeah.
And I like that. Like the steady and firm idea is different because strengthening seems to feel like more like when like you're using load or you're like challenging muscle or something and engaging muscle groups, but stability is more than just like muscle engagement, maybe.
Yeah, there's many aspects to it. You need coordination as well. There's a neurological aspect. You need the soft tissues to also be strong enough to hold you so that you actually have the least amount of muscular engagement. You still need some, but what's the minimum that you need in order to maintain that position?
Right. And then the other stuff that you added into the concepts is that goes with stability is stretch, flexibility, and mobility, and then hypermobility. And I guess I'm curious, why did you add that stuff into this one that wasn't in the last one?
Well, I guess that was something that did evolve from the first book to the later books. I started to detect a swing in the yoga world against hypermobility. And it became kind of, never encourage hypermobility, never allow a student to go to their end range of motion. And I started to notice a bit of a nocebo coming into the teaching, that we're starting to create a fear of mobilizing to an optimal amount. So I wanted to kind of explain that there are different types of hypermobility. And there's really kind of a spectrum of these terms that I use in the book. And as you just mentioned them, stretch is something that yoga teachers use quite a bit. But to me, stretch is an elongation that happens as a result of a stress. So we begin with a stress. We put a stress on, say, our hamstrings. We do a forward fold. We're stressing our hamstrings. That may result in a stretch where the hamstrings elongate. But the stress is not the same as the stretch, because you can put a stress on something and it may not elongate.
It may resist and not elongate, right?
Right. It may actually shorten, or maybe compressing the body into the body. Like when I fully extend my elbow out, now my ulna is hitting my humerus. There's a stress in the elbow, but it's not tension. I'm not lengthening anything. I'm compressing these two bones together. And bones, they react well to compression. So there's a difference between stress and stretch. There's a difference between stretch and flexibility. Flexibility I defined as kind of like the range of motion of a joint. How much can you move that joint? But flexibility is different than mobility. Now, these are my definitions. Other people have different definitions. But if flexibility is your range of motion, mobility is your ease of motion. Like how easily can you go through your normal range of motion? And that requires, I say, strength and coordination, as well as compliance of the tissues and the joint capsules and so forth. But then hypermobility, there's two ways you can define it. Hyper is usually used in the terms of beyond normal. We talked before about normal is like 95% of what the population can do. And if you have a range of motion that's outside that 95%, you're either hypo, you have too little motion, or you're hyper. But just being more than the average person isn't inherently dangerous. What's important is to understand what are the contributors to hypermobility. Like, why is somebody hypermobile? And when I look at it, there's really three conditions that can result in this hypermobility. One is somebody's got an injury. Say like a baseball pitcher, he's hyperextended his elbow. He's throwing fastballs too much. And he's hyperextended the elbow. That's damaged. The joint capsule and the ligaments around the elbow are damaged. Now he could go too far. He could actually break his joint. So he has to be very careful. He's developed hypermobility in that elbow. Then you got a second class of people who, through just the luck of the DNA lottery, they have genetic differences in the way their body builds their collagen fibers. Collagen is the restraining tissue that forms our ligaments and joint capsules, and they prevent us normally from going too far. They stop our motion when we get to kind of like the limit. These people, they've got more stretchy collagen, and they could go too far as well. Now, that's fairly rare. These are conditions like Ehlers-Danlos or Marfan syndrome. And it used to be said in the textbooks that 1 in 5,000 people have these conditions. Well, today we're starting to recognize it's more than that, maybe 1 in 100. But
yeah,
still,
there's a spectrum now. There's a spectrum disorder about it.
Yeah, right. But that's the second type of hypermobility. The third type, and the most common type, is it's simply the shape of the bones that determine how far can you move your joint before the bones hit each other. And if that's what's causing your great range of motion, then you're not risking an injury. You don't have a genetic disorder. You're just doing what your bones can give you. And that type of hypermobility is completely safe. And there's no problem for me going to my end range of motion, even though it's more than 95% of people, if it's just going to where the bones naturally go. But if it's damaged, or if it's a genetic disorder of the collagen, then yes, I have to be careful. So I wouldn't rail against somebody being hypermobile until I know what's causing their hypermobility. Because for most people, it's not a problem at all. But for other people, it definitely is a problem.
I guess that really goes to the problem with, and you mentioned this to me, I think in one of your emails, that there's an issue with trying to decide what's healthy or like right for someone's body by just looking at it from the outside. So just because someone has like a range of motion or something that's more than what you would expect or is something, doesn't mean that that's a hypermobility that's a problem. Like that, right. That hypermobility could just be fine and it's not a problem, or it could be a problem. But to just assume because of that range of motion that's a problem is not necessarily a solid place to stand.
Exactly. So that's why I call it dangerous hypermobility. Well, hypermobility by itself is agnostic. It just means, oh, look, you have a huge range of motion. Then you have to drill down and say, is this a problem for you? Like someone with Ehlers-Danlos, it's not just their range of motion. Their collagen disorder can affect their heart, their blood circulation, their digestion, because it's all the collagen in the body, not just in their ligaments and their fascia. It's the collagen that wraps their blood vessels and binds the liver and so forth. So these people, they do have a systemic issue that they want to be very careful about how they use their body. For other people, I've seen people with just amazing shaped bones. And you think of in my latest book, I talked about the elbow, the upper body. People who hyperextend their elbow, they go past straight. Now that freaks out a lot of teachers. And it freaks me out when I first see it, because if I was to do that to my elbow, I'd break my elbow. So I can't do that. But I see other students who can, and I go up and ask them, like they're in down dog and they're hyperextending their elbows. I ask them, how do you feel? And they usually look at me and smile and say, I feel fine. Good. Now, what are you feeling? What are you feeling in your elbow? Nothing. There's no pain there? No. Well, when you come out of the pose, is it going to hurt? No. How about tomorrow? Is it going to hurt tomorrow? No. These people have had this bone shape their whole life, and it's the bone shape that allows them to go past straight. And now, why do I have to correct that? There's no danger for them.
Yeah, I know. And I think it comes back to what we were saying about kind of assuming certain normals or averages that don't account for like the massive variation that exists.
Yeah, and my experience isn't the same as hers. And like most yoga teachers, I want the best for my students. And if I did that, I'd hurt my body, so I don't want her to do that. Not recognizing that I am not her. She's got a completely different body than me.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.